Hello! Today I'm delving back into Final Fantasy with a more considered look at the design, form and function of some of the in-game peripherals. And having played Final Fantasy VII and the Final Fantasy VII Remake back to back, it's interesting to consider the array of weapons at our disposal and how, unlike some games, such as Final Fantasy VIII, that limit our options with regards to weapons, or games that encourage other means of obtaining them, such as synthesis and so on, Final Fantasy VII was unique in that it offered a wealth of arms that came with their own pros and cons and were strategically placed at particular stages of the game to complement or alter our progress. And taking a few of these and observing the attributes, I think, is a solid insight into the game design and strategic structure of Final Fantasy VII. And it's also another opportunity and a slightly different perspective to look at the lore, story and characterization of Cloud Strife. So, jumping right in, it's first worth noting the significance of the sword as weapon for Cloud. And like most Final Fantasies, the sword is the signifying weapon of the hero character, or the central protagonist, with the exceptions being only a handful of games, such as Final Fantasy XII, which was much more customizable and had no clear-cut hero to begin with, or Final Fantasy XV, which likewise permitted Noctis an array of arms, though notably the more regal swords are exclusive to him as the hero. And looking more broadly at this is something that roots back to our cultural origins as a species, and swords are historically symbols of protection, of status and strength, and whether it's the Arthurian legend of Excalibur in The Sword and the Stone, the Prophet Muhammad being gifted the sword Zulfikar by the angel Gabriel, or even Frodo Baggins receiving Sting in The Hobbit, each of these is a symbolic moment that confirms status upon a figure, and more often than not establishes them as a sort of protagonist or hero. And Cloud Strife, particularly in his inheritance of the Buster Sword, is no exception to this, and we'll touch on that shortly. So, kicking off, the first weapon I think worth discussing is Organics, and I was somewhat torn where to land on this first weapon, as there are several noteworthy blades preceding this one, such as the Butterfly Edge, and the much more aesthetically distinct and renowned Hard Edge, which found its way into the Final Fantasy VII Remake too. But like these aforementioned weapons, the Organics represents what we might call a milestone acquisition with regards to game progress. And what I mean by this is there are certain moments in the game where you have the opportunity to exponentially leap up in terms of weapon strength and stats, and where the Butterfly Edge does this when we reach the milestone of Cosmo Canyon and that scenario, so too does the Organics provide a leap up in stats for Cloud at the time it can be gained from the northern continent and the Icicle area. And I suppose the reason I felt the Organics edged it into the top 5 over, say, the Butterfly Edge is that at this later stage of the game there is much more at stake and there's much more variety of weapons with which to determine what way we want to go with our hero. For example, around the same time we obtain Organics, we can also obtain the Enhanced Sword, and where the Organics has excellent attack power, the Enhanced Sword, which is only a paltry step up from the much older Butterfly Edge, has better magic statistics and more paired materia slots too. So this is a great example of the pros and cons and the democratization of the mid-game weapons in Final Fantasy VII, and I suppose how the game is much more player determinate and bound to whether we, as the player, want Cloud to be more of a spellcaster, which favours the Enhanced Sword, or a melee warrior, which favours the Organics. Turning to aesthetics, the Organics is a pretty ostentatious blade among a whole suite of ostentatious blades, and I think it's fair to say that the weapon design in Final Fantasy VII, particularly for Cloud, was among the most far out and liberally creative with its array of huge broadswords. And while I appreciate the subtlety and the minimalism of weapons like the Buster Sword and the mean-looking Butterfly Edge, which I think is a great blade, the Organics did have a great ostentatious look about it with its modular, multi-edged aesthetic, so that makes it into the top 5. Next up, we have the Yoshiyuki, and despite Cloud handling predominantly broadswords and these sorts of weapons, a couple of them do resemble katanas or nodachis from feudal Japan, and the Yoshiyuki in particular is the most powerful katana-type weapon in the game, which comes with its own set of unique attributes and connotations that bring it firmly into my top 5. Now, looking first to the naming conventions, like many Japanese names through Final Fantasy, the sword has real-world references and connotations, and it may well reference an existent figure, specifically the samurai Ryomo Sakamoto, who also had a katana named Yoshiyuki, which means good luck. But more so than that, the Yoshiyuki's unique attributes in Final Fantasy VII also lend themselves even further to the folklore and the mysticism of ancient Japan. Specifically ideas around the katana containing the soul of the samurai, and that the swords may be imbued or cursed with souls to make them powerful, such as the legend surrounding the swordsmith Muramasa. And those who have watched my Tekken episodes will know this is something that also Tekken explores too, with Yoshimitsu's blade feeding on the energy which is sapped from its wielder. So, looking to Cloud's Yoshiyuki, this likewise stands out as a blade that benefits from misfortune, or perhaps assuming the souls of victims, since it has the unique attribute of doubling in strength when one of our allies dies, and then it triples in strength if both of our allies die. So beyond its unique aesthetic as a katana-style blade, it has this really intriguing element about it that has the potential to make it one of the more powerful swords at its point of acquisition. Moving on, I'd next like to discuss the nailbat, simply because it's so absurd. But like many Final Fantasy games, Final Fantasy VII comes with, if not a comical weapon, because the nailbat's not quite that, then certainly a conspicuously strange one. And the nailbat is just such an entry. Now, at the time we're able to obtain the nailbat at the clock tower in the Temple of the Ancients, it is among the strongest melee weapons it's possible to get for Cloud, but its use, particularly for those inclined towards magic and materia growth, is something of a short-lived novelty, since it doesn't provide any slots, its resale value is pretty low, and it doesn't have any unique attributes besides increasing the chance of a critical hit. But this aside, it certainly has the aesthetic edge and distinction among Cloud's arsenal, and like the aforementioned hard edge, it's also found its way into the remake titles as well, in much the same conditions. So, for the sheer weirdness and brutal crudeness of the weapon, this makes it into the top 5. So, coming on to the final two, as might be expected, we have Cloud's ultimate weapon, Ultima, and this has the distinction of being his strongest weapon on its base stats alone, but it also has some cool flourishes in its aesthetics and abilities, such as, much to the opposite of the Yoshiyuki, which thrives on misfortune, it is much more powerful when Cloud has high health, and its colour and aesthetics change based on Cloud's strength. So the weaker he is in terms of HP, the dimmer its glow is. So there's quite a cool correlation here between the weapon and the battle progress and our status there. But as with all weapons, it gives with one hand and it takes with the other, since we have no AP growth with the Ultima weapon equipped. So that's a minor obstacle of this being a truly unsurpassable weapon in Final Fantasy VII. Finally, another reason it makes my top 5 is, as a huge Final Fantasy VIII fan, I love that the Ultima weapon makes a cameo appearance in that game when we come to face Ultima weapon, the boss in the Deep Sea Research Laboratory. So one of the very infrequent crossovers we have with Final Fantasy swords, particularly between these titles in the late 90s. So this brings us on to the Buster Sword, and while its base statistics make its value negligible towards the middle and end stages of the game, it is steeped in lore, story, and narrative depth that rightly make it the signature hero weapon across the Final Fantasy VII saga. And one thing I will say, without inching too far into the Final Fantasy VII remake mechanics, is that I do love the levelling mechanic they have for the weapons in that game, because it helps maintain their purpose and their use case even as we proceed later into the game, without them becoming redundant. But looking to the Buster Sword, this has evolved to become almost a character in and of itself, and it is representative of a certain lineage and a certain code of conduct that has dictated Final Fantasy VII from its origins. But even omitting the wider compilation material within the confines of Final Fantasy VII proper, it is still hugely representative of the relationship between Cloud and Zack, and Cloud's pivotal appropriation and muddling of being a soldier first class that drives his core story forwards. And I think the history between Zack and Engiel preceding this in Crisis Core only serves to augment and further improve this idea of history and significance around the Buster Sword as we continue to experience the Final Fantasy VII saga. So I think it's an awesome contribution to the Final Fantasy VII story. Turning to aesthetics, this is also important to mention, and I have covered this in my dedicated Cloud episode, which I'll link to below, but the design of Cloud Strife and the design of the Buster Sword were huge selling points and visual intrigues around Final Fantasy VII when it was first teased back in 1996-97, and the spiky blonde hair, the huge disparity between Cloud's size and the broadsword itself, and his comparative minimalism in design compared to other JRPGs, was a major factor, I think, in generating interest around the game. And to this day, it's an iconic feat of character design that, combined with the aesthetic inversion of Sephiroth, really helped seal Final Fantasy VII's repute and legacy within the games industry. So there we have it, a short look at Cloud's arsenal of weapons and how they dictate the pace, playstyle and progress of Final Fantasy VII proper. I think it's worth an honourable mention to the Fusion Sword from Advent Children and the Bandage Buster Sword from Kingdom Hearts, which really lent themselves to those particular media and were aesthetic set pieces. But really, I think how these items are placed throughout the game and how they work is a really good case study for how game design and complexity is navigated in the development progress. Plus, they're just really cool things to discuss and look at. If you got this far, thanks very much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. And feel free to drop a comment below and let me know your thoughts on the weapons in Final Fantasy VII.